I am fascinated by insects, especially the ant. Love ants. Stink bugs, though, not so much. This past fall, our house in the country was infested with stink bugs, and I'm far from alone in that. There's sprays to get rid of them, but they're toxic. I've tried sucking them up with a vacuum. Even the old bug stomp, which is gross. Nothing seems to make a difference. So I did a little research. Turns out they actually aren't called stink bugs at all. True stink bugs are from Asia and have swept across most of North America, but they're not in the Kootenays yet. The flying bugs we see here in the basin, which we mistakenly call stink bugs, even though they do stink, are western conifer seed bugs. They're a native species, and I'm not imagining it. Their population has exploded, mostly because of human impact. For one, we've affected climate. Warmer winters have increased the survival rate of eggs and larvae of the western conifer seed bug. And remember that heat dome from a couple years ago? Stressed trees produce more cones, and guess what the little guys feed off of? Entomologists, those who study bugs, assume changes in temperature and landscape are creating a boom to the lowly insect we incorrectly refer to as a stink bug, which has no real predator, by the way. We've changed the landscape, and the western conifer seed bug has adapted and thrived, and that kind of stinks. Hi, I'm Mitchell Scott, Editor-in-Chief of Kootenay Mountain Culture Magazine, and this is The Headwaters, brought to you by Columbia Basin Trust. On this podcast, we're going to examine altered landscapes and the effect they have on wildlife here in the basin, from iconic mammals to the humble stink bug. Because of human beings, the Kootenays look a lot different today than they did just 50 years ago. In some cases, we can't change it back. In other situations, we have the opportunity to keep this spectacular landscape and its species intact. We're going to meet biologists, ecologists, and others working to do just that. We'll start with species most at risk, ones in danger of local extinction. Bob Keeney has more on that. Bob, I take it we're talking about caribou.
Yeah, we are. Caribou are one species we're going to talk about. Once abundant here, a relative of the reindeer, by the way, but disappearing right before our eyes. Not long ago, Mitch, there was still a hunting season on caribou in the Kootenays, if you can believe that.
That's unbelievable.
Yes, there are seniors who remember a time when caribou were almost as abundant as deer in many parts of the basin. Now it's possible our children may never see a caribou. We've changed their habitat to the point where they're just being pushed out, one mountain range at a time.
It's that bad.
Yeah, it's taken a single generation for this species to absolutely collapse. There's only about 2,500 caribou left in all of British Columbia, and it's a small fraction of them that still remain in the Kootenays. They just keep getting pushed north. First, they were pushed out of the U.S. altogether over the last 20 years. Then they disappeared from Kootenay Pass, then from the Kimberley area, then from the Rockies. Now, the only existing herds are north of Revelstoke and the Cusp, and they are dwindling. Their habitat just keeps shrinking.
I remember traveling over Kootenay Pass 5 or 6 years ago and coming across 5 caribou, beautiful animals. Why are they getting pushed north?
Because humans keep impacting their habitat with things like logging, with snowmobiles, with helicopters, with climate change, with roads. Roads are terrible for them. There are some species, Mitch, that do well with humans. Deer and black bears come to mind. Caribou just do not. They're like grizzly bears. Humans move in, caribou move out, despite tremendous efforts to try and keep them on the landscape. But it's a real combination of factors, and most of it's man-made. We alter the land, and caribou are susceptible.
What efforts were made to try and keep them healthy, say, in Kootenay Pass?
Where you saw them?
Yeah, where I know there was a herd just a decade ago.
Yes, that herd's been moved up north and was amalgamated with the Cusp herd.
Like in helicopters or trucks or?
Trucks in that case. What happened was the province tried everything else. They tried to limit logging. They tried to close the backcountry to motorized recreation.
And it opens up pathways for predators like wolves.
Does it ever? Both do, both recreation and logging. They even attempted some well-meaning but disastrous caribou transplants to bolster the herds, both in Kootenay Pass and around Kimberley. Finally, they just gave up and moved those herds up north. The last few animals were moved to the Nakusp-Revelstoke area, which is where our struggling herds still exist, but barely.
So what's the plan with these herds moving forward?
Well, to find out, let's head to Nakusp and meet a young biologist and forester.
We're going to go inside the pen. So we've got this gate set up mostly for our shepherd access.
I enter this massive pen with biologist Aaron McLeod. The pen's longer than 3 football fields and surrounded by a fence 11 feet high, shrouded in a form of black waterproof material so predators can't see in. In this pen, Aaron and other caribou shepherds keep an eye on the animals.
The pen is 6.6 hectares in size. The feeding area is a regenerating forest from an old cut block, so it's a bit more dense. That's why we thinned it out. But the majority of the pen is within older mature hemlock forest, so it's a nice open forest with big overstory hemlock trees.
Okay, so how does this caribou pen work?
Well, in the spring, government biologists fly over the most southerly herd of mountain caribou. That's the South Selkirk herd. There's only around 30 animals remaining. And without intervention, they would likely just die off like the other herds. So they pick up the pregnant cows in the herd and move them into this pen. It's part birthing center, part daycare for caribou calves. Here's how Aaron describes it.
You keep them here while they are pregnant and while the calves are young until they're about 6 to 8 weeks old, and feed them and care for them and monitor them throughout that time. Other than that, you just let everything happen naturally with their births and that sort of thing. And then you release them once the calves are old enough that they can keep up with their mothers better and avoid predation. And you release them into the wild straight from the pen, and they go back out to where they normally would be ranging. So the whole point is to protect them, protect the cows and the calves while they're most vulnerable when they're pregnant and when the calves are young.
What they're doing is keeping these new calves away from predators, mainly wolves, but cougars and bears too.
But isn't predation just part of nature? Isn't this a natural system happening?
Yes, it is. It definitely is. But humans have skewed the natural rhythm of things. We log the forest, and caribou lose old-growth lichen in the winter to survive. We build those roads, which are terrible for them. And that's just part of the impact on the landscape.
So there's less habitat for the caribou, more predation on them. The winters are different than they used to be because of climate change, so they're struggling through winters like they probably wouldn't have before. So it's just a bunch of different factors, and they're not as adaptive as other species have been to all that. So that's why they're declining so rapidly.
Resource extraction also, logging in particular, you build roads. Roads are another pathway for predators, correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so it's the blocks, like the blocks that are young right now and supporting browse for ungulates, other ungulates. That's the issue, as well as the roads that are kind of pathways and highways for predators to gain access.
So we scoop them up and put them in a pen?
Yeah, desperate times, Mitch. We also now shoot wolves from helicopters to try and control predation. And we do things like this. Biologists allowed hunters to remove most of the moose in the Revelstoke area because predators were drawn to the moose and killing caribou too. So for a few years, it was basically open season on moose.
Are the moose going to come back?
Yes, they do eventually because they adapt more readily than caribou do. What we're trying to do is restore some kind of balance on the land because we've altered it so much. Listen to how Aaron answers the question of why we do step in like this and play Mother Nature.
We've been letting nature do what nature does for a while now, and the population is still declining, and it's to the point where this herd would be extirpated within 5 years because there's only around a dozen females in the herd now and the breeding population. So this is kind of the last step that we can take that we haven't already tried for this herd to hopefully increase calf survival, because that's the part that the caribou are struggling with. They're not having enough calves in the wild that are surviving to an age when they can contribute to the population because of a multitude of factors. And the government is implementing other recovery strategies and habitat protection and that sort of thing for the herd. But we also need short-term recovery actions like this to keep caribou on the landscape.
Desperate times.
Yeah, desperate times and desperate measures, but it's a necessary action if we want to keep them on the landscape.
Will this maternity pen work in the end?
We haven't had great success in the Kootenays with maternity pens in the past, but there is a First Nation in northern BC that has had some real success. They are dealing with a much healthier herd to begin with. And penning, too, keep in mind, is part of a much bigger strategy. There's also restrictions on the land for loggers and people and heliskiers and recreators, snowmobiles, too. It's just this intensive effort to keep this herd healthy.
There's a lot of pressure and interest on this herd, and we want to do everything we can to make sure they survive through it.
Sadly, they're a symbol that something is out of whack.
Yes, they are. They're like an indicator species.
Keep in mind, Mitch, this is the oldest terrestrial species in the Columbia Basin, and they're just dying out because of how the landscape has changed. It's nothing like what we already did to water. So let's go there. Let's take a walk down to the Columbia River near Castlegar with another biologist, James Crossman. James takes me downstream from the Hugh Keenleyside Dam across from Celgar, the pulp mill. James is one of the leading white sturgeon biologists anywhere in the world. He drops a hydrophone into the Columbia to listen for tagged fish. James has worked his whole career trying to revive another species that's been around for hundreds of millions of years, like caribou, but is also facing extirpation because of how their habitat's been altered.
Sturgeon worldwide, as a group of fishes, there's 27 species in the world. They are the most imperiled group of fishes in the world. So over 85% of species are vulnerable to extirpation or extinction at this point. White sturgeon in the Columbia are listed as endangered. Sturgeon overall as a species under the International Union of the Conservation of Nature are considered vulnerable.
How many do we have in the Columbia Basin?
So we have around 3,000 what we consider existing wild adults. So these are fish that have been here, ever since changes to the river and dams and other industry have been undertaken.
Just like with caribou biologists, James is trying to save another species, the white sturgeon.
Yeah, so we've written about this in the past in our magazine, and these are enormous fish from a prehistoric time.
Yeah, the largest freshwater fish in Canada. They can live up to 100 years old and grow to be 10 feet long. This is one tough fish. There's this great story of RCMP finding a poached Fraser River sturgeon in a refrigerator for who knows how long, but they think overnight. When they took it down to the river, it just swam away.
No way.
Yes, these fish have survived ice ages, but they cannot survive what we've done to fresh water.
The issue with the population is they're undergoing what we call recruitment failure. So we have insufficient numbers of really young fish surviving to an age where they would then reproduce. The bottleneck really seems to be from about 15 days after they hatch from eggs in the river until about 6 months of age. We see very low survival. Like the survival is not high enough that we'd get enough individuals for the population to persist.
Okay, sound familiar? Young white sturgeon are not surviving long enough to reach breeding age. Female sturgeon do breed late in life after about 20 years, but they're not reaching that age in the wild. They are in decline because of dams and changes and flows to sediment and spawning accessibility, stuff like that. Again, we've altered the landscape and we've affected a species.
They've evolved to survive for a long time, and we've made changes, humans have made changes to the areas that they live within a single generation. So their ability, because they're so unique, because they've evolved for such a long time, because they mature late in life, all of these really unique characteristics that have allowed them to survive over those millions of years really complicates their ability to adapt to really rapid change.
So what's the prognosis for sturgeon?
Better than caribou. It's much easier to rear sturgeon in hatcheries and release them into the Columbia than to capture caribou.
I remember our kids would go out to the dams and they'd release sturgeon as a part of their elementary school program.
Yes, I think the CBT helps fund that. Mm-hmm. It's been a real cross-border effort, too. James is quite optimistic about their recovery, in fact, because there's this habitat restoration. There's curbs on industry now. There's rearing sturgeon, as you said, in hatcheries. And biologists on both sides of the border are really working hard on this struggling species. Obviously, it's the dams on the Columbia that are causing this, but they're trying to mitigate for those giant walls of concrete. And that's the larger point here, Mitch. The oldest terrestrial mammal in the Kootenays, caribou, are dying off. The oldest aquatic animal in the Kootenays, white sturgeon, are in trouble too. And what does this say about us and what we've done to land and water?
And we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, an argument could be made these are two old world species, the oldest in our ecosystem, and genetically maybe they're not engineered to adapt. That is not an argument I would make, and it's sure not one our two biologists would make either. They've both dedicated their working lives to keep these species on the land and in our waters.
Sturgeon are reflective of the ecosystem health of the Upper Columbia. So, they're really important top predator. They keep the balance of the ecosystem here in the Upper Columbia. So it's critical that we conserve and recover and protect this species to make sure there's a balance with the health of the ecosystems.
You've committed a lifetime to this.
I have, yeah. I've worked on sturgeon now for my whole career, so over 20 years now, and that's not going to change. I'm really passionate about recovery of threatened and endangered species.
What do we lose if we lose caribou?
We lose a very important species to our area and to their local ecosystems. And we lose the battle of trying to make up for all the damage that we've done in the past.
It's a bit sad we've got to this point where we're driving this herd further north and further north and further north and having to take their young and put them in pens.
Yeah, it is sad that we've got to this point, and I don't think anybody would do this if it wasn't a necessity.
Bob Keating with two biologists who have dedicated their lives to keeping species healthy. Two of the oldest animals on the continent. Over in the East Kootenay, there's the same kind of conservation work happening to try and preserve another iconic species, as Lindsay Clegg tells us from Radium Hot Springs.
I'd say there's about, roughly 40, 3 to 4 dozen.
The founder of WildSight, John Bragensky, skillfully leads me to a sizable herd of Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, grazing on the 18th fairway of the Radium Golf Course.
I like the guys who are enjoying the sand traps. It's like laying in the beach with the spring sunshine.
This golf course is irresistible to bighorn sheep, with its manicured grasses, light snow load, and ready escape route from predators.
It's pretty typical. This is where the grass is green early in the season, and they've got something to eat here. And you can look out in the distance. Yeah, there's quite a few.
The manufactured landscape of this golf course is not in itself the problem. It's how the sheep get here that is killing them. Right next to the golf course is Highway 95, and it's become a slaughtering ground.
The big transport trucks, the chip trucks that are going by right now, those guys, they can't stop for anything.
The sheep linger on both Highway 93 and 95 because of another man-made problem. The salty brine used to melt ice on steep hills into Radium is irresistible for them. They linger and lick the brine, oblivious to the passing vehicles.
You can have an annual loss, actually, of about 10 sheep per year due to collisions with vehicles. So that one has been our hotspot of problems for at least 30 years.
Wildlife biologist Irene Teskay says Rocky Mountain sheep are part of the identity of Radium. They hold an annual festival here called Headbangers, dedicated to the iconic species. But in the winter of 2022 alone, 10% of the local herd was killed by vehicles.
We had a really bad winter, not this winter, but the winter before, and it really had a huge public impact. They were very upset, and understandably so, that so many sheep were getting hit on the highway.
Finally, people of Radium had enough. They realized they had to do something about this preventable mortality. They only had to look north to see what could happen to their sheep herd.
So when we come through this gate, this is where our Rod and Gun Club has been feeding the sheep through the winter.
Just off the Trans-Canada Highway, near Golden, Brian Gustafson opens a gate built to keep sheep off the road. The highway into Golden is being widened, one of the most expensive projects in Trans-Canada history.
The Kicking Horse Canyon herd of bighorn sheep, I would say, is struggling, to put it simply. Collisions on the highway seems to be their biggest limiting factor, and also habitat loss through fragmentation.
The Kicking Horse herd is down to just 15 animals, not a self-sustaining number. So the Rod and Gun Club, along with the Ktunaxa Nation, have stepped in and taken dramatic action. They keep a close eye on their movements, maintain fencing, and even feed bighorn sheep to try to keep them off the Trans-Canada.
I guess I feel like a sense of responsibility for them now. Every time we have a loss in the highway, I kind of do take it personally. Feel like I have to work harder and harder to try and prevent further loss so that we can continue to have sheep in the Kicking Horse Canyon.
The Kicking Horse herd is in such dire circumstances, extirpation is very possible. And it's the same situation for the herd that ranges on Highway 3 over the Salmo-Creston. Sheep and highways do not mix.
We count every couple weeks, and the most that we've counted in the Radium bunch is 135 this year. When I first counted, a decade ago, we were 250. So we definitely dropped a lot.
Back in Radium, bylaw officer Ken Keeby and others are taking extreme measures to try and keep their herd healthy. The losses of 2022 convinced the province to drop the highway speed down the long hill into town. First Nation members also patrolled the two highways in a truck with flashing lights to get drivers to slow down.
In my mind, it was great. There was something going on, cautionary and the sheep signs on the vehicles and, the flashing amber lights on the trucks. So in my mind, it worked well. It worked well, in combination with the reduction of speed.
Keeby says the new actions, in part, cut mortality in half in 2023. And the province plans to build an overpass over Highway 93, much like what's been done around Banff. The landscape will not be changed back to what it once was. So people in Radium are adapting to save this iconic species.
Actually incorporating them into our plans and trying to keep them on the landscape. If we lose them due to human issues, whether it's direct mortality or whether or not it's just too many people on the landscape, I think that's an extremely sad day.
Great story about saving a distinctive Rocky Mountain species. Now let's head up in the mountains and flip rocks looking for lesser-known animals that crawl and slither.
Got some signs of spiders and insects under here. I grew up outside, catching snakes and lizards, very much like I still do. So I've been very lucky to just kind of live out my childhood dream.
Jacob DeLise is a biologist who specializes in reptiles and amphibians, the kind of creatures that suffer when the landscape changes, yet we know so little about them. Jacob's example is the western skink.
Western skink is one of two lizard species we have here in the Kootenays, and is found in little open pockets like we are here at Marsden Face. The habitat is changing, and also introduced predators. House cats are a huge problem. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who said, I moved to my little rural paradise, and my cat used to bring in western skinks, and now I don't see them anymore. So that's definitely an issue. It's a really interesting species that we have locally here, which some people may have caught a glimpse, hiking. The young ones have a bright electric blue tail. Most of the year they spend underground. So spring is a really good time to see them. A lot of these species, lesser known species, reptiles and amphibians, we don't have the long-term or even short-term monitoring data. But as far as what's happened to the habitat over the last few decades, definitely fewer than there used to be. I've looked at air photos from this area from the 30s, and these sites were a lot more open, a lot fewer trees, shrubland, and fewer trees. So the habitat's definitely changed, and we know there are fewer of them for sure. So half your job is getting to people to know about these species and getting them to care. They're on the landscape. They're an integral part of the landscape. If we lose them, I think it's just tragic. I think we lose a part of ourselves.
And that's our podcast about altered landscapes. The Columbia Basin Trust does incredible ecosystem and climate change work. You can learn more at ourtrust.org. You can also see cool photos and read about these stories and others on our website, headwaterspodcast.com. I'm Mitchell Scott. As always, thanks for listening.